Assalamualaikum, Assad.
Walaikum Assalam. Aksa, how are you?
Good. I finally figured out how to unmirror my video. It was very confusing for a second.
So
Hi
how did you do that?
AXA, hi AXA. I would just like you guys to know that you guys are live. So please.
Okay.
Thank you, Babar.
Dear viewers, now we move to our next segment, ethics for AI adoption.
Saira, your video is off. Let me just ping you in. Please start.
Dear viewers, now we move to our next segment, ethics for AI adoption, moderated by Aqsa Sati.
Thank you, Saira, for that. Are we live? Can someone confirm?
Yes, we are live, Aqsa. We are just waiting for Azfar Jamal Saab to join. You may begin. He'll join shortly.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much for Saira for handing the session over. I would like to welcome everybody who is joining in for just our session or who is new. Welcome to the CXO Global Forum Global Digital Summit. We are very, very excited to be partnering with CXO Global Forum. We at ACCA Pakistan, we at ACCA Global really enjoy and really get excited by conferences such as this and summits such as these, because this really gives us a perspective on how we can play our part, and how can we support our partners into fulfilling the goals that very much align with ours as well. Today's session for today's so this session is going to be under the topic ethics for sustainable AI adoption, as Sarah mentioned, connecting AI and ESG. So we have a huge, well, not a very huge panel, but I would say huge in terms of stature and experience. We have some really notable names. We have Mr. Narayanan, Vaidyanathan, who is our portfolio head business future, head of business insights, ACCA Global, and the author of the report as well, because ACCA, as if someone is watching this and is curious, I would like to guide you to, there's a wealth of resources that ACCA focuses on. It's called ACCA Professional Insights, that can be accessed on our website, can be accessed through a different, through a standalone app as well. So there is a lot of wealth of resources that you can access that have multiple professional insight reports, as we call them, that are about ethics and sustainable AI adoption, or just about artificial intelligence, and different kinds of goals that we have, different kinds of areas of focus that we have, that you can definitely get some insights on, because I do believe that all of the attendees do have similar goals and aspirations as we do. So that's going to be a very interesting thing. We have Mr. Narayanan with us, and who he's going to be giving us a little bit of a brief on his report, or giving us a presentation on his very, very insightful report. And then we have Mr. Assad Hameed Khan, who is the head of strategic partnerships at ACCA Pakistan. He will be a part of our panel discussion with Narayanan. And we have Mr. Azfar Jamal, who is the director of DIGINC Technologies. So it's going to be a really insightful panel discussion. We'll give in the starting, we'll give some time for the presentation, and then afterwards we'll have the panel discussion. And if anyone has any questions, you can direct them to me, and I will start taking those questions. So can someone please confirm, because I can't see, do we have, okay, perfect. So we have Narayanan with us. So over to you for your presentation.
Sorry to interrupt you, Aqsa. We just got a message from Assad that Asfar Saab would not be joining. He has a meeting at PM office.
Okay.
So you guys may.
So I think we have two amazing gentlemen with us. So I think we can direct the questions for Mr. Azfar to them, if that's okay.
Yes, sure.
Okay, perfect. So over to you, Narayanan.
Thank you very much, Aqsa, and hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to be joining in this discussion, which is, by the nature of its topic, a very forward-looking, future-facing area of thinking. And as Aqsa mentioned, on the back of a recent piece of work that we've done at ACCA. So what I'm going to try and do is share my screen so that I can share a few slides. So please do let me know if you're able to see the slides which I'm trying to put on the screen now.
I can, yeah.
Let me put it onto full screen. Yeah, so hopefully you can see that on full screen now.
Yes.
Excellent. And Aqsa, just so you know, when I'm on full screen, I can't actually see anything in the chat box. So please feel free to jump in if there's something you need to let me know about. So hello, everyone, once again. And what I want to do was just spend maybe about 15 minutes, no more than that, just giving a very quick whistle-stop tour of this piece of work that we did at ACCA jointly, actually, with Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand. And really, the point of this exercise was to understand there's been globally a lot of discussion about AI, and there's also been a lot of discussion about how to do it right. And so in that context, we did this piece of work looking at ethical AI for sustainable outcomes. And what I wanted to do today was just reflect a little bit on that, and also where it connects with, because there's a big leadership theme that runs through this piece of work. And that obviously relates to the CXO agenda. From an ACCA perspective, of course, we tend to talk quite a lot about the chief financial officer, the CFO, but of course, the fact is that many of our members and many of our stakeholders do a range of different roles, including chief executive officers, including other kinds of founder roles, and of course, including accounting and finance leadership roles as well. So in many ways, the perspectives in this piece of work are grounded from our sort of anchor point within the accountancy and finance world, but they also apply actually quite broadly to organizations in the public and private sector, I think more broadly than that as well. It's probably worth saying that there is a certain amount of empirical evidence that we have to ground our thinking. We did run a global survey of accountancy and finance professionals around the world. This is a mixture of ACCA stakeholders as well as Chartered Accountants Australia and New Zealand stakeholders. So there's about 5,700 respondents. It's quite a large global sample. We had about 335 or so respondents from Pakistan, and the main point of this is really to do a bit of a reality check before we go any further in terms of where do we stand right now. So where we stand right now is roughly about, and these are use cases that are particularly relevant to our stakeholders, but if you look at audit and assurance, probably just under 10%. And actually, the Pakistan numbers are tracking the global numbers fairly closely on the audit and assurance and on the broader accountancy and finance related tasks like preparing statements, management reporting, and using AI for informing decision making. So about 1 in 5 on that. And then in the middle, you've got other broader reported users outside of accountancy and finance, between 10 and 15%, depending on the location. So that's kind of roughly where we are in terms of when we are talking about adopting it, deploying it, and doing stuff in the right way. And I think the point here is that we're at a sort of an inflection point, because the expectation that we see in a lot of conversations we're having is that over this decade, to the end of the 2020s, there's an expectation of quite a significant increase in these adoption numbers, which are already quite real. So a lot of this stuff is not just lab or experimental proof of concept. Many of these people are using it in their day-to-day operations now. And that is expected to ramp up quite considerably over this decade. And what that means is that at that point, it will start affecting people's lives when it starts entering the mainstream. And that's why it matters how you deploy it and how you go about it. And what I wanted to do to reflect on that was just look at it across those 3 lenses of ESG: environment, social, and governance. Because in many ways, the leadership agenda that we looked at was through that lens, because we were looking at sustainable adoption of AI. Now, you might wonder, what does this have to do with the environment? We're talking about AI and business use cases, presumably. Yes, we are, but equally, if we want to have long-term value, then we have to create ways of engaging with it that are long-term sustainable. One of the aspects of that is the environment. And what we found was that AI has a dual relationship. It's both part of the problem, and it's also part of the solution with respect to the environment. So in terms of part of the problem, we expect as the algorithms get more complex over time, and they're already starting to get quite complex, the energy consumption is going to be more and more. Already for certain things like natural language process algorithms, there's studies that have been done which show that the NLP usage is something like 100 round trips between New York and Beijing, something like that. So this is non-trivial amounts of electricity consumption and energy usage. And as the algorithms get more complex and the use gets more widespread, that will be a factor. And all of this is powered by a data center somewhere in the background that is generating a lot of heat. That heat needs toxic chemicals to cool it down in the same way that you would have in a refrigerator. Now, the point is, from a front-end business professional, you're not going to get into all that level of detail. But what matters is for things like vendor selection and procurement. Are you thinking about, as a leader, are you thinking about those as being criteria even that you think about when you're selecting vendors and asking them what their view is? Because to get value from AI, it's not just about accuracy. The most accurate AI algorithm is not necessarily what you need. The more accurate it is, the more energy it consumes, but that depends on the use case. You need a lot of accuracy if you're trying to use it to predict whether someone has cancer. You need much less accuracy if you're using it to predict what the next movie recommendation should be. So there's a kind of business judgment issue here of what your use cases and how much accuracy you need and how much energy it will consume as a result of that. It's also a question of explainability, because the more accurate your algorithms get, the more complex they get, and the more complex they get, the less explainable they get. So if you're operating in a regulated environment like banking, and you're giving loans to people and the loan decision is based on an AI engine in the background, you might need to be able to explain to the regulator why X was given a loan, but Y was rejected. And so, there's an optimal amount of complexity and therefore an optimal amount of energy consumption as well. So it can be a win-win if one thinks about the business use case and the judgment very carefully and how one's deploying it. So the problem that is the environmental impact can be managed as one goes through that thought process. On the right-hand side is actually where AI can also be a little bit part of the solution, because these are both companies that we spoke to, IBM and Datamaran, in the course of this work. But the IBM, as you can see, has already started thinking about how they operate and their environmental footprint in a very structured way across all the things they do through this responsible computing initiative that they call. But on the right-hand side, when I'm talking about AI as part of the solution with respect to the environment, it's a broader point around the fact that everybody's heard about data explosion. What is also true, though, is that a lot of that data that we're generating and will generate in the future is unstructured data. So we're not talking about stuff that you can put in an Excel spreadsheet in rows and columns. It's emails, scans, pictures, videos, stuff that historically we wouldn't have thought of extracting insight from. But as we look ahead, these things are going to be really crucial sources of insight. And AI, the use case for AI is very strong here because it's very good at dealing with unstructured data that previous technologies were not very good at. And so it can be part of the solution, I'm saying, on this environmental issue, because I'm talking about greenwashing. Many of you will be aware of the COP26 summit that has been happening, that recently concluded actually in the UK. And a lot of countries have made lots of pledges about becoming net zero by a certain point in time and so forth. And downstream from that, many companies and organizations in those countries also have been making lots of promises saying we're also going to become net zero by 2030, 2050, etc. The problem is that a lot of this stuff is marketing. There was a study done by the European Union, in fact, which said that around 50% of the stuff they saw in the EU region, they couldn't find, when the organizations were putting stuff on their website, they couldn't find any evidence in the background to say that they're actually doing anything that maps to what their environmental claims are. So greenwashing is a real issue. And if you want to be a responsible, ethical leader, you don't want to be saying things that don't have any basis in fact. And one of the ways to deal with that is to have tools that help you check that. So this is actually, I'm not going to get into the details of how the tool works, but the basic IP that they have is they've taken a very detailed taxonomy which they've created. So each of the terms there that you have, those little white boxes, things like energy use reductions and alternative energy sources, climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, human rights, each of these terms is at the highest level in this chart, but their IP has a taxonomy that goes back several layers, and they can scan entire industries and see, what's being said across multiple, because a lot of ESG data is unstructured. It's in company reports, regulatory filings. It's not just the numbers, it's narrative form information. And so their technology using AI can help to understand what people are saying, what they're actually doing, and map those intelligently beyond just a keyword search to see how many times the word climate change featured in their annual report. It's not that simplistic, it's much more complex. So the main point I wanted to make there was really on the E of the ESG. AI, has a potential to be a friend and also a challenge. And I think the leadership element is in harnessing it in the right way. On the S bit, which is the society, I think it's fair to say, we tracked across people's perception of their rights as an employee, as an individual, and as a consumer. And as you can see, it's a sort of a descending order from top to bottom there. So essentially, stakeholders were most nervous about the impact of AI on their rights as a consumer. And as you can see, some of the comments there on the right-hand side, ODG participant is, by the way, an online discussion group. So we also ran a discussion group to understand some views. But I think the substantive point here is that if you have to deploy AI in a way that is responsible, then we need to think about employee rights, individual rights, and particularly consumer rights as well, in terms of how their data is used and confidentiality issues around that, and making sure that people's rights are not infringed in that respect. But I think alongside that, there's also a slightly more bigger picture point around impact in society more generally in terms of how much the benefits are shared. Because one of the issues is that, again, as we look at the data there, most people or the majority of people, whether it's in Pakistan or globally are positive, and they feel that AI impact on overall standard of living, 60-70% feel, yeah, it's going to have a positive impact. But actually only about half that proportion feel that that impact will be shared equally. So the concern about level of inequality is actually quite high. And AI is quite, it's an exponential technology, so it can have massive impacts at far beyond a linear increase in impact. And so the public interest obligation and doing things in a way that is equitable, and particularly for people who are vulnerable, underrepresented, marginalized, the impact on all of those is also going to be really important. And then I think when it comes to the nitty-gritty of actually deploying AI, the governance factor, the G of the ESG is crucial. And again, from a CXO kind of perspective, tone at the top very clearly is a huge factor here. I would say it's the umbrella factor on which everything else lives or dies. So the way you deploy depends a lot on that leadership. There are a whole range of things here. This report, incidentally, is available on our website. It's Ethical AI for Sustainable Adoption. So for those who are interested, I'm going to do, as I said, a bit of a whistle-stop tour here, but for those who are interested, the report is available on the website. But I think the main point I'd say is leadership matters in terms of making it real. So you can have ethics policies, but ultimately people take it seriously because they look at the tone at the top and see how the leaders behave and what they actually do. You can see some comments on the right there, it's cross-section of people. This is people from around the world, by the way. This is not specific to any country, but in the online discussion groups that we ran. But it's just to give you a divergence there. One person saying the attitude towards AI from the CEO is, sell anything remotely close to it for as much money as possible because the AI label sells. So that's one extreme bad example. But then on the other hand, you also have other leaders who've got a much more thoughtful approach to it and who are thinking about it in terms of transforming their organization, opportunities in terms of forecasting, robotic process automation, chatbots, and as an ongoing journey that's continuing, and that's crucially aligned with their strategy. It's not just an opportunistic jump into the use case right now because it's a cool thing to do and it's what everybody else is talking about. I think bias will always be an issue with AI, and many of you will be familiar. This is a bottom-up technology that learns from the features of the data. So if your data is biased, then the outcomes of the AI will be biased, and there can be second-order bias as well. So if you're using it to hire people, for example, you might basically, if your training data set doesn't have anyone who's applied for part-time roles, then your AI might assume that if someone's applying for a part-time role, then they are not fit to do the job. Now, you might have second-order correlations there, where people applying for part-time roles may be highly correlated with people who are women, for example. So without intending it, the AI might be biased against hiring or considering female candidates. So there are complex things there where you can't just leave it to the AI, and it's important for the leaders and others to think through those things and make sure that their deployment of the AI is consistent with their organizational values, for example, around diversity and inclusion. I think data is another key aspect where leadership is required. As you can see, we asked people, when you look across the data life cycle from collection, use, storage, spread, and destruction, where's the biggest issue? So for data quality, the biggest issue is at the front end. So if you set up systems where you collect good quality data at the front end, you're going to be much better placed to manage data quality throughout the life cycle and as the data flows through your organization and it's used in your AI. On the other hand, for confidentiality, it's more of a normal distribution, a bell-shaped curve, where the biggest issue is in this middle bit, the storage. So what people seem to be saying there is, as long as I'm doing something with the AI, I'm collecting it, I'm using it, I'm disseminating it or destroying it, it's easier for me to stay on top of that. But when I put it in secure storage and forget about it, that's when I'm most at risk. So these are the sort of issues that leaders need to have on their radar, we believe, to make sure that the deployment is done in a way that respects laws, regulations, confidentiality requirements, and so forth. I think on delivery and oversight, the first point I'd make on delivery is, as it says on the left there, AI is a strategic decision. So what you don't want with AI is, one team somewhere embedded deep inside a business unit that the rest of the organization doesn't know about. There's one product manager who has a relationship with some random vendor, and they decide to do some AI thing, and it stays there. That's what you don't want. What you want is something which has got that C-suite visibility. For AI to really succeed, it needs to have data that's used from different sources so that you can really get the benefit of that ability to analyze. And it needs that kind of breaking relationships, people silos and data silos across the organization. That's when you're going to unlock the value. So it's really important that the delivery respects that that requirement for really a C-level leadership to drive this. And I think in terms of the oversight aspect of it, whether it's evaluations, it's whistleblowing. So if someone wants to challenge the decision made by an AI, you need to have whistleblowing mechanisms in place to assist with that, whether it's cybersecurity of the AI system, whether it's lessons learned. Again, this is what I was saying, so that you need a senior person overseeing it so that lessons learned in one use case or one deployment can be shared and the same mistakes are not made again. Common sense stuff, really. And also training. I've got on the right there, ethics and professional skills module, which is one of the things that within ACCA we are thinking about in terms of making sure that the whole notion of dealing with technology and technology ethics is very natural and intuitive for our stakeholders as much as we can. So really, in conclusion, I'd say when it comes to CXOs driving value capture, the first thing we feel is around setting the tone at the top. So aligning to organizational values, whether it's diversity, inclusion, not having bias in the way you think about it, and being transparent if things go wrong. That's also where the leadership aspect comes in. Evaluating for sustainable value. So this is about long-term. This is why I was talking about ESG and those things, because it's not just about how do I extract value from one particular thing at one point in time. If something blows up in your face 6 months or 8 months after you've started doing it, the reputational risk from that will probably wipe out any tactical value that you're trying to derive. So sustainable approaches are really important. Exercising judgment. Checklists can be useful, but you don't want to be just relying on checklists because AI is new and it might create new situations which haven't been seen before. So it's really important to exercise judgment at all times. You can't suspend that. And also building a culture of compliance, both in letter and in spirit, is really important because everything is not about policing it. It's also about people buying into a certain culture and a certain way of doing things. Joined up delivery. So this is about cross-functional teams, people and data connected across silos, so that there is that real ability to unlock the value from what AI can do. Assessing vendors and working with the right sorts of people. And this is a little bit from the perspective of a business-oriented CXO who might not be a tech person themselves. Embed mechanisms for contesting decisions and for whistleblowing. So there needs to be that element of being able to really challenge decisions and understanding redress if people aren't happy with something or customers aren't happy with something. Prioritizing data. I think you almost can't talk about an AI deployment without having a proper strategy, a data strategy. So confidentiality and quality are two of the big things I'd call out there. And finally, building knowledge and skills, because this is an ongoing journey. So I think as CXOs, there's a responsibility to create a learning culture within an organization, training courses on the job opportunities, and also sharing through lessons learned from the adoption, appropriate documentation and so forth, so that learning culture and continuous improvement culture is really embedded in the way that the approach to AI is handled. So that was a very quick whistle-stop tour. I hope that gave a little bit of a perspective on how we're thinking about it here at ACCA. And I look forward to the discussion to follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. That was very insightful, and I think this is the second time I've kind of gone through this. So I really, really do learn a lot from it. I think it's one of those things that before I came into ACC, I used to think of the future as the whole matrix situation, but now that we learn about these things, we know how we can control it. And just for the audience, I do have to state that being in an organization like ACCA, where we do put focus on ensuring that our members and future members are future ready, they are one step ahead of everyone else. They know what to expect going forward in their corporate sector, in their business sector. So essentially where these things come out, and these things come in handy. People like Narayanan who focus on things like this, who focus on creating professional insight reports and other, we have a lot of different kind of training modules that can train our members and future members on things like this. So this is very, very, very insightful. I would also like to bring forward and introduce Asad Hameed Khan, if he can be spotlighted as well. Can we spotlight Asad? Because I don't have the admin controls. So we have Asad Hameed Khan with us, who is the head of strategic partnerships for ACCA Pakistan. Asad has a vast experience in this field, and he sorry, I dropped my pen. So he is going to be joining us for the panel discussion today. We had Mr. Azfar Jamal, who has been called in for an important meeting at the last moment, so he wasn't able to join, but we will be directing our questions to both of these panelists. So I hope that's okay. So I'm just going to start because, again, I'm going to build up from the professional insights presentation that we saw. So one thing that I was kind of observing, and this is my question to you, Narayanan, that is it very hard for a person who is not maybe a tech savvy? So because the definition of CXOs and CFOs and CEOs, they're changing. The job descriptions for those roles are changing, and they're changing every day. Do you think that even in organizations that aren't tech companies or aren't in those sectors, do you think because of these AI adoption goals that all of them have, do you think being a tech savvy person, or is it important to be a person who has some knowledge and experience of technology, of directly working with technology? Will that become important, or is that a requirement to work on AI?
That's a very
Over to you. Yeah.
Thanks, Aksa. That's a very good question. I think I've lost.
We can hear a couple of people. Okay, perfect.
Great. Thanks, Aksa. It's a good question, and I think it's also an important question because it's something which goes beyond AI. Not everyone may be interested or looking at AI in their organization, but they might be looking at other types of technologies. They might be looking at getting better value from their data through data analytics. They might be looking at robotic process. They might be looking at something else. But I think the question is a broader one about how to engage with tech, especially if you're not a particularly tech-orientated person. And is it essential? So I think my view on that would be that as a CXO type or someone who's in that space, the main thing is, I think, to understand the implications of deploying the technology rather than how the technology works. So how the technology works is a different question, and that you can work with people who do that for a living on a full-time basis. That's fine. But I think at the CXO level, the implications of deploying a particular technology are very important to understand. And those implications could be around value capture. So, why do I need to do this? Or rather, what is the nature of the upside that I would get from doing this, and being really clear about that? It could be about risks. It could be about understanding what the risk appetite of your organization is and what risks this new technology could pose in that context. It could be about understanding process and costs. So what kind of business process re-engineering you might need to do in your organization in order to adopt this technology, and what kind of costs, net costs. So there'll be costs in adoption, but you may also save some costs elsewhere. So what kind of net cost structure you're looking at. It could be about talent and people and skills, and what implication engaging with this type of technology has for that. So I think it's important to think very much from the lens of the implication of dealing with the technology rather than the detail of how it works. Otherwise, you risk getting into a sort of information overload. There's a lot of things that are happening, and the worst thing that one can do is to get paralyzed, because there's so many different things going on, and you just feel you feel that unless I understand something to the nth degree with full detail about everything, I'm not going to even touch it. And the point is, for the CXO, they might not need to understand everything themselves. It's more about understanding the bigger picture implications, and I think also retaining a growth mindset. So the whole point of the growth mindset is ultimately the barrier to learning something new is not intellectual. Most of these things are not intellectually difficult. The barrier to learning something is generally emotional, because people feel, you know what, it's just not my thing. I can't deal with it. I'm busy, or it's my head hurts. It's just not my thing. So that barrier is often emotional, and the growth mindset is about being able to fight that, being able to break that, and being able to say that you are open to embracing something which you haven't seen before and to learn from that experience. So I think those aspects are more important when you're a kind of broader business oriented professional seeking to engage with tech in this way.
Right, I think that really sums it up for us. I would also like to take Assad's perspective on the same. And Assad, I would also like to have your opinion on why ESG has become more relevant and how it's impacting, because you do work with a lot of public sector companies as well. So if you can shed some light on how important of a part that's playing into our futures.
Yes, thank you very much, Aksa. So if you could please confirm if I'm audible.
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Loud and clear, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. So I think Narayanan has picked up on many important areas. So starting with the point that you picked up with Narayanan, I think it's all about really seeing the outcome, visualizing how a particular decision strategically is going to impact the organization, what value you're going to derive, not just for the organization, but for all its stakeholders, starting with your internal stakeholders. So there has to be key focus in terms of integration, you see, working on the culture, trying to understand what segments of your internal and external segment stakeholders would be impacted through this decision, what efficiency you are aiming to drive, what sort of customer experience you wish to generate out of it, what sort of competitive edge this decision will create for you. And at the end of the day, there's a very clear focus for organizations that it does require cost, but it is one of those very few cost decisions that would result in cost reduction going forward. So we're talking about future ready, we are talking about future facing, we are talking about thinking ahead, forward looking. So it's all about staying relevant and ensuring that you're able to provide innovative solutions to your stakeholders so that you're always in their radar of preference. So moving on to your next question in terms of, you see, ESG and ESG's importance. Again, you see, if you apply the same lens on that, why is environmental, social, and governance over the recent years picked up in terms of, you see, limelight when it comes to, as accountants, when we speak in terms of reporting, what sort of information is being provided to the external users of the information that is generated by the organization itself. Then it's also in terms of not just the external users in respect of being consumers. It's all about, if you are a company that is seeking expansion, that is listed on a stock exchange, that is going to be invested into by potential investors. So what sort of considerations they have, what sort of multiple markets they operate in, what sort of competitive edge you can get through your ESG footprint, making sure that you remain a preference for these investors, not just as an investment decision. We're also taking them through their investment life cycle in terms of value addition they are seeking for their decision to be a stakeholder that has their financial capital deployed in your organization. Another very important element of ESG, you see, beyond being just a buzzword or a fashion statement, is the sort of public trust it is able to generate on the organization, that how responsible you are to not just your stakeholders, whether internal or external, but to the environment itself. What sort of impact you're able to generate on the society. You see, ACCA, if you look at our very DNA, we are very proud to say that we are a force for public good. we help create opportunities for people, and at the same time, we reduce artificial barriers. So it is all about really presenting a platform for people to adopt a lifestyle which going forward is going to really impact societies in the way they form and provide opinions to the organizations or to the workspaces that they work in. So and then you look at you see the governance element. So Narayanan picked up on that. So governance historically has been around the boardroom conversations, around compliances, around the code of corporate governances, around the corporate laws that or the other laws that each organization is expected to comply with. But now with this increased reliance on digitally enabled technologies, so let's not forget that artificial intelligence probably is a step or is at the, you see, advanced spectrum within digital transformation. So, and it's all about data. So how well you're able to preserve data, what sort of privacy the policies you have, how you can secure that information in terms of the trust or the promise that you've made to your stakeholders in terms of use of that data. So last but not the least, you see, it's a great tool in terms of really developing this as your brand or as an asset for your corporate reputation. In not just, you see, helping investors unleash or unlock their investment appetite or expected returns on investment, but at the same time being preference for the consumers who are really now becoming aware in terms of the business practices each organization is putting in place and how that is going to positively impact the organization, the society, and the economy that not just the economy in which they operate, but beyond those borders as well. I hope that was able to capture the breadth of the conversation you were expecting.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Asad. And I will also request our audience, if they have any questions regarding the report or regarding anything that our panelists are saying, you can ask them in the chat section, and we will ask our panelists those questions once our panel discussion has concluded. I'm going to go back to Narayanan. So I have to ask that there is, because it's a new thing, relatively new, even though this is something that there have been, flags about raised, and a lot of concerns are being raised about AI, and a lot of companies have been adopting it for, I would say, decades now. But there is going to be that still pushback. There is going to be from whole sectors, there's going to be a bit of a resistance in terms of adopting it. So which sectors do you foresee suffering the most, and also which sectors do you see prospering the most from it?
Yeah, thanks, Aqsa. Again, that's a really fundamental question, actually, in many ways. And I think one of the first things to say about AI, it's a so-called general purpose technology. So it's not really a technology that is trying to change one sector or one use. It's a bit like, I suppose, if 100 years ago people had looked at when electricity was invented and said, which technology or which use case will electricity be used for? The fact is it's embedded in everything we do and how we live our life. And that's where I think AI will go in 100 years from now or 70, 80 years from now. But I think to your question about the industries, I think conceptually, the first thing to say is I think anything where you have extremely routine tasks, where you have tasks which are very repetitive and which are quite routine. Already traditional automation is actually quite good at dealing with those things, and AI will be even better. And it will be able to take on quite a few of those sorts of tasks, regardless. And I think that's a industry agnostic point. It almost doesn't matter which industry you're talking about. I think it's worth saying that from an accountancy and finance point of view, I mean, ACCA has been around for 110 years or more. Lots of technologies have come in that time. Quite a few have gone as well. I've spoken to some, older members of ours who, were in the 1980s when spreadsheets first came and desktop computers first came. And there was this view that actually finance people are not going to be needed now. This is going to do everything. And you fast forward 30, 40 years, and actually it's all about how well accountancy and finance professionals partner with Excel. In fact, they're among the biggest users of Excel in many cases when you compare across industries. So I think when you talk about disruption, the one thing to say is the nature of the disruption matters. So I think for accountancy and finance professionals, I see a huge opportunity. I see a huge opportunity to partner with the technology and to really extract value in a win-win way, where a lot of the routine tasks can be left to the technology to do, like AI, and where there are tasks requiring business judgment, requiring understanding of how the accounting standards need to be applied using judgment in that context, understanding where ethical judgment is required, understanding where client management and understanding of requirements of stakeholders is required. But there's so many other things where I think, in fact, the role of finance professionals is going to get potentially much richer because they'll be moving up the skills value curve. So I think, first of all, in terms of if you look at this line of work across industries, I think there's all to play for. I think in terms of industries more generally, to your point, I think financial services industry is already been going through quite a lot of innovation in this space, and I think that will continue, and I think it needs to continue as well. There's a huge opportunity for certain processes and certain elements of that industry which have been the same for a long time. If you look at fintech, as it's called, as an area, there's a huge part of that is driven by things like AI. So there's a huge positive opportunity there to bring disruption in the right sort of way. And again, how you manage data, as Assad was saying, will be very crucial. If you look at initiatives like open banking in the UK or PSD2, which is the Payment Services Directive in the EU, they're all about banks and financial services opening up the data of their financial data of their customers, which was locked away previously, to third-party software providers who can then make better options and solutions. If I want a budgeting app on my phone, I can get it now because a third party, I can give consent for my data to be given to that third party, and they can come up with really helpful budgeting app type solutions, which my bank might not be able to provide me or might not provide me. So I think there's a lot of innovation there. And I think a huge opportunity for innovation is also in the education sector, in terms of ed tech, in terms of thinking about how tools like AI can create personalized learning, adaptive learning, where depending on the needs of the learner, the platform can evolve, remote invigilation, various other things. And I'm sure Asad will have some views on some of those as well. So let me take a pause there and pass it back to you, Aqsa, if I may.
Thank you so much. And I was also going to, while I was hearing your conversation, I was also intrigued in asking Asad his perspective on how it will impact not only accountancy education, not only the kind of education that we give at ACCA, but education in general, because we've seen it do a whole 180 in the past 1 year. It's completely shifted on how we, I think virtual learning was not in the next decade if we had not had COVID. So not thanking it, but still we do owe some credit to COVID. I will take Asad's perspective on it. And I would like to add this example that I heard when I initially joined ACCA, that when ATMs came out, a lot of bank tellers thought they'd be out of jobs. But the workforce didn't reduce just because ATMs are now a common thing. They were just used, they were upskilled, they were used for better things. Their time was more effectively utilized. So over to you, Asad, for your perspective on the same.
Yes, thank you, Aqsa. See, this reminds me of an interesting conversation we had recently on another conversation, that where we talk about relevance. So the conversation was that we are in the group of 5 panelists representing about 120 years of experience, and then how relevant is that? So the unanimous feedback was that probably 70% of that experience is not really relevant anymore, simply because the sort of rapid advancement we have seen over the last 18 months. You see, the COVID has been an opportunity in many ways. So the areas that Narayanan has picked up, I would say the key benefit that comes out of this sort of technology adoption and the way it is advancing is that how it is able to really create an inclusive environment. Previously, you see, there were a lot of variables. You had to be physically present, you had to travel, you had to have the means to be there. But now with this sort of digital enablement, you can see all segments of the society. So when we talk about, you see, the equitable inclusion of the diverse representation that we have within the social or the economic strata, you would see that this sort of new ways of education, learning is really going to increase the literacy. But for that, the most important thing is, number one, how digitally inclusive we can make the entire process, where people, while having the means to access this technology, at the same time are literate, are aware in terms of how to access this technology. Yes, Aksa. Sorry, you're on mute.
Aqsa, we are not able to hear you. Aqsa, we are not able to hear you. Please join back.
आप कॉल करके बताओ. Akshay, we are unable to hear. Probably you need to log back in. Just try unmuting now. Can you hear us?
Sir, considering that maybe Aksha is facing some issues, maybe we can take some questions in the meantime.
Sure. I mean, I think there's maybe if I'll just jump in. Assad, is that fine if I take one from Fahd? I see there's a question for me specifically by name there. It says,
yes, brilliant.
If a machine makes a decision that harms humans, has unintended adverse consequences for businesses, or is simply not in line with what society deems acceptable, who is responsible? So this is a really important question, Fahd, and it's at the heart of a lot of discussion around AI ethics, because it's a question of accountability. Now, there is this concept of human in the loop, and the general direction of travel is that ultimately legal systems are predicated on the idea that there needs to be human accountability. You can't put an algorithm in jail, right? So fundamentally, the premise at the moment is that there is human responsibility even when AI is deployed. It's worth saying also that most business cases, because sometimes there can be a view that we're talking about some kind of very futuristic so-called AGI, artificial general intelligence, which has a consciousness of its own and operates on its own. That's not the reality. The reality is that we're talking about narrow AI. Narrow AI is used for very specific use cases and to optimize very specific processes or to make predictions in very specific contexts. So for example, pricing algorithm for the airline industry, which is quite a complex pricing algorithm with lots of different moving parts and which change dynamically in real time. And you might use an AI machine learning solution in the background for that. And there is actually a court case which happened, I think it was the German carrier Lufthansa many years ago now, where their pricing algorithm went all over the place and charged all kinds of prices for tickets. And the court ruled that actually the company was responsible to reimburse the customers. You can't just say that the algorithm did some stuff based on dynamic changing external market conditions and changes in the input data. That's not going to work. So I think it's really important to think about the governance structures and making sure that human in the loop aspect is considered to an adequate context, and also recognizing that within AI, there's something called model drift. So what model drift means is that when you set up an AI or a machine learning for a particular use case, it might work well at that time, but AI is dynamically learning. So as new data comes in, the AI and the way it treats the data changes, and it should, because that's why it's learning. That's why it's machine learning. But what that also means is that it may behave differently over time. It won't behave exactly the same way in perpetuity. And that's again why the governance aspect becomes really important here. So I think for a variety of reasons, the answer essentially to the question is that the organizations that are deploying these systems, particularly given we are talking about narrow AI in the reality of business usage, the organizations do retain responsibility. There's no two ways about that in my mind. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you, Narayan. Aksha is back.
Yeah, I was just going to check if I'm completely back. And believe we are taking questions, but I have lost all of the questions from the chat since I rejoined.
So Aqsa, if I can help you with that. So there's another question, Narayanan, which I believe that you've already answered with Murtaza Hassan asked this question, that if there's any significant ethical issues that have been recorded till date pertaining to AI, so you've cited the Lufthansa example. So if we move on to the next question, Aqsa, if I can help you with that, considering that the world is moving towards lean initiatives and automation, how soon can AI in the short term or in the long term replace or reduce the role of auditors within the accounting firms and finance functions in the organizations? So Narayan, would you like to start first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the evidence so far and what we are seeing in terms of the situations within an assurance context often is, so one of the things that many vendors have been saying for a while is the potential to look at the entire population of the data rather than a sample. And so the issue becomes, you can look at it in much more granularity, and you don't have the uncertainty that sampling involves. That is true, and that makes sense. And it's typically used in things like anomaly detection. So where you have unsupervised machine learning algorithms, basically they're very good at spotting patterns in the data without having any pre-existing rules embedded in them. So for example, if you give a bunch of transactions to an AI engine, it might be able to work out, having looked at enough data, that if a transaction happens out of hours at 11 o'clock in the night, maybe there's something fishy going on, and it might flag that transaction. So in that kind of anomaly detection, it's quite good at doing that. But the reality we still find, to be honest, is that the assurance function is broader than just the bottom-up kind of data patterns. There's a whole piece around that in terms of certainly what we are being told in terms of understanding the context, and in terms of particularly when you think about issues that have happened in this space where companies have been audited, and then 2 months later they've gone bust, and so there've been a lot of regulatory movement around the role of the auditor, the role of assurance, and my kind of view at this stage is that there is still a significant amount of understanding of the business judgment, particularly where you're making taking views about going concern of the organization and so forth. I don't think it's enough to just look in a limited way, the way that AI would look at. And my view, as of now at least, is that it's excellent as a support tool, and that's the way that most of the products we see are positioned. We don't yet see a situation where it could just completely replace an auditor, because there seem to be quite a few moving parts to that. But I'm happy to take views from Assad as well. He might have some thoughts of his own.
Thank you, Narayan. And I think that is the key. You see, you can take the machine out of the human, but not the human out of the machine. So when we talk about individuals and the judgment that they're supposed to exercise with the situations and with new trends emerging, I think the key integration with something like AI would be another tool we you see oftenly link with digitization nowadays, and that is the analytics. So when we talk about analytics, so analytics help us really understand a particular pattern, but do we have the bots? Do we have other machines who are able to take a corrective measure without the intervention of a human? So that's a key question. You see, like every, I would say, sector and every thing that we do today, the 15 years down the road, the way things are done now will totally change. There's this World Economic Forum report which says that 70% of the jobs that we see today may not be relevant in 15 years' time. But does that mean that people will be out of jobs, or people within their respective professional space will not be relevant? That is not the case. New jobs emerge, new skills are required. So it's a matter of continuously adopting, learning, unlearning, and evolving yourself, that you're able to really innovate, not just from an organizational perspective, but as an individual, so that we are able to not just, work in the times to come, but also capture what sort of changes can be anticipated in the future.
I think, thank you, Asad, for also, by the way, doing the questions as well. Vakar has so kindly given me the question, so I can, I think, take that on from there. So I do have a question, and I think I'm going to add on my question from that as well. We have a question from Dr. Aisha Abrar, who works at NUST Business School, and she says that she is working as a director quality assurance at NBS and collects data for various quality assurance standards. So she has a question regarding the use of AI for analyzing the type of data we collect for quality assurance purpose and how much costly can it be. And so that's Dr. Aisha's question. My question is from her question that how ethics can play a part in collecting that data. For example, we at ACCA, we're very, very careful, and we do not let our data go to any third parties. It's a completely no-no area for us. So how sure are we when we are utilizing a service that's using AI, that our data is going to that? There's a lot of security concerns that are raised from that usually. So over to Asad for you.
Yes, thank you, Aksa. You see, there are many things linked to that. So just taking a step back. So in terms of quality assurance, so she representing NUST Business School. So there's a practical example. You are setting up a syllabus. You're creating content. So how much of that content is original? We have multiple tools, like Narayanan mentioned, that these are tools that support the human decision making. So let's say we are doing a check hypothetically on how much of the content has been reproduced from already available resources, so that any intellectual property right is not infringed. So we do a plagiarism check. But once the plagiarism is identified, so does the tool have the ability to rewrite those sections and create additional content? So one step of the quality assurance met, but to do the next part where the corrective or the remedial measures are required, obviously the human intervention comes in. Secondly, the question around ethics. You see, ethics, if I were to ask a question, ethics minus the digital age, would the principles be any different? If we are back in the 20s and 30s where rotary phone has just come in and that is the norm, so would ethics be deployed any different? So if we have a rule-based, principles-based approach to ethics, so you would identify that as the tools evolve, your ability or the need to evolve your policies accordingly should be in a way that caters to the new peculiarities generated by the use of technology. The best case AI, obviously we have to think of it from the lens of multiple stakeholders. So how would the consumer want the data to be used? What sort of internal data is available that obviously does not infringe on any IP rights, but could be very costly if it is leaked? What sort of data is, transformed into information that is relevant for an investor's decision making? So at the end of the day, you see, data integrity is not just about privacy. It is also about transparently including information for the decision making of a lot of the stakeholders around us. So it would be a complete spectrum from, I would say, privacy to transparent disclosure.
Yeah, I think that is something that we have to make individual decisions on based on our organizations as well. And I think there will be probably laws made for it, and there are already in process as well. So I'll also extend the same question to you, Narayanan.
I think Asad's done a great job. I think he's covered all of the bases. I mean, I think in summary, all I would say is, ultimately to your, I guess more to your follow-on question, Aqsa, in terms of the data collection, the relevant principle here is of informed consent. So you have to inform, and you have to the informed refers to the purpose for which data is collected. So you have the informed consent. The informed is about what is the purpose for which you're collecting the data, and you stick to that purpose. Any change to that purpose, you need fresh consent, and you need explicit consent. So not implied consent. I think it is also, although that's not always needed legally, but my own view is that that's probably the gold standard way of doing it.
Yeah. So thank you so much for that. I think because we are close to our closing time, and I do want to take closing remarks from you, I think this will be our last question. How effectively can AI be used to devise an algorithm to assess trends of stock market or of digital currency market? If such an algorithm is developed or used to gain an advantage, would it be ethical to do so?
Narayan, please,
Yeah.
would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I think the first thing to say is that algorithmic trading already happens. So it's not, so AI already is used in the stock markets. It is used to predict movements in stocks. And as far as the crypto market is concerned and all of that, I think there's a whole additional layer of regulatory considerations and various factors. But in principle, the idea of, I guess, if you were to look at from a stock investor's perspective, the fundamental and the chart perspective, fundamental obviously not relevant here, not looking at individual companies, but if you were to look at chart-based trading, I think there's a very rich history of using AI to analyze trends and to try and get very, very tiny advantages across very large volumes of money to create the spread that you need to achieve the returns. So I think it's the short answer is yes, it's possible and it's done. And there will be clever people who do it, and there'll be possibly even more clever people who misuse it. But that's all part of the world we live in, I think.
And I think it's one of those situations where you've been given the tool. How you use it determines how ethical the use of it is. Asad, do you have anything to add for this?
Yes, Aksa. You see, in my previous life, I've been an asset manager. I've worn both hats, an asset manager as well as a regulator. So seeing the things from both perspectives, and then added the audit and assurance, which has been part of my experience as well. So yes, you see, every trader is looking for an advantage. Anything which is done within the framework and the dictates of the law, anything which is able to provide an investor with an advantage which is acceptable within the what is right within the law. So laws nowadays have really evolved. This sort of trading generally happens with individuals, but there are certain funds out there that you see make use of specific quantitative methods. They're called quant funds. There is a certain qualification in terms of the investor eligibility, whether you're high net worth, how qualified you are, how aware you are, what sort of profile you have in terms of risk appetite. So this, despite, and like Narayanan mentioned, that it has been there for a very long time, and the regulators have done a good job in terms of really profiling these sort of investment products and techniques, and also profiling the investors who can benefit from it if it is being utilized beyond the person who created it and is expecting wider participation in that sort of investment strategy.
Thank you so much, Asad. I hope that answers our participants' question. I know that Narayanan has to go to another meeting, so I'll just take your closing remarks first. And do you have any, because this is CXO Global Forum, so if you have any advice for leaders who will be adopting AI or who are adopting AI at the moment. So any closing remarks for them?
Thanks, Aksa. I mean, I think in closing, all I'd say is it's been a great discussion, and I'm really pleased to be a part of this discussion. I'm not sure I'm in the business of giving advice. I often find that that's a dangerous thing to do. But what I will say is that what we are learning as we go along is that we have to think in an interdisciplinary, interconnected way. And I think CXOs are like the glue that binds different disciplines in an organization. And they need to provide that leadership and that top-down overarching umbrella view so that you can really extract value from technologies which are coming through, and so that different parts of the organization are coordinated in that process. So I think CXOs and leadership is really critical. This is not a technology story. This is an organizational and a societal story as well.
Thank you so much for that. We'll let you go. And thank you so much for being part of this discussion. It was always very insightful to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Narayanan.
Thank you, Assad. Thanks, everyone.
Over to you for your final remarks.
Yes, Aksa. So my key takeaway would be that, you see, watch this space. It is going to evolve. It is going to transform. It is going to be there in a very different form. So how we build our own knowledge and skills around that. So it's both an individual's responsibility as well as the organization's responsibility. But at the same time, I think the important bit is to remain human, use this information as tools trying to, work for the benefit of the stakeholder matrix that you have. So as long as we have got the intent right, as long as we have got the outcome in sight, as long as we are looking for sustainability, this space is not going to stop. And just like we see everything else, 30 years back, BlackBerry was an innovation. Today we have smartphones. 50 years back, we had rotary phones. Nobody could even predict mobile phones. We are talking about AI. Previously, we had Excel, and similar spreadsheet tools that we use for information. Now, all these tools have been brought into this artificial intelligence, or let's say automation space, where they are beyond the usual utility and are fantastic decision making, or tools that support decision making. So continue to learn, continue to evolve, and let's not just make it a responsibility for the organizations that we are working for, the institutions where we are building and acquiring our skills. It's also an individual responsibility as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Assad, and thank you so much for your insights and your time. And I would also again like to thank CXO Global Forum for having us today. Over to you, Saira. Signing off from here. Do we have Saira with us?
I believe she's not here. You guys may leave. I'll take it.
Okay.
Thank you for
Thank you so
your session.
Thank you, Baba. Thank you, CXO Digital. Fantastic initiative. Best of luck.